Hello. Coming up, we will explore the fundamentals of IT logic, touching on why we should care about IT logic, the key components of IT logic, and how to apply leading-class IT logic within your organization or with your clients. From Durham, North Carolina, I'm Kristen Hughes, and these are just some of the topics we'll be exploring in this February's Tech Advisory edition of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. Welcome. This is a podcast from the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of the AICPA and CIMA. If you've just discovered us, it's good to have you along. You'll find plenty more to listen to in our archive over at gobeyonddisruption.com. In the hosting seat this week, I'm Kristen Hughes, an Associate Director of Technology with the Association, and I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. Our topic this week is the fundamentals of IT logic. And joining me to explore this topic today are David Kovar and Amanda Wilkie, both members of the Information Management and Technology Assurance Executive Committee with the AICPA. Welcome to both of you. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us something about yourself, where you're based, who you work with, and how that work connects with our topic today.
Thank you, Kristen. This is David Kovar. I'm the CEO of Tax Prodigy, and I've spent the majority of my career focused on technology for the accounting profession, and I'm based in Chicago.
And I am Amanda Wilkie. I'm a consultant with Boomer Consulting, and after about 13 years working inside of technology organizations in public accounting firms, I joined Boomer Consulting about 3 years ago, and I focus on technology consulting and process improvement. And Kristen, I'll tell you, I'm excited about this topic because coming from a technology background, having a computer science degree, I am far from technical these days. However, I truly believe that understanding the fundamentals of IT logic have really helped prepare me not just for a career in technology, but a career in the public accounting profession as well. So again, super excited about this topic.
And of course, Amanda is a returning guest on our Go Beyond Disruption podcast. When she last joined us, it was in June of 2018. So thanks for being with us again, Amanda.
Happy to be here, Kristen.
Why don't we start by discussing why organizations and practitioners should care about IT logic? Why is it so important?
Sure. So data is the lifeblood of finance, accounting, and business in general, and IT logic is the set of rules to leverage and control data. There's actually a huge range of technologies that people use to actually embed IT logic, including things such as Excel, RPA, which is robotic process automation, desktop RPA, which includes tools like Alteryx, and analytics like Excel, Power BI, and Tableau.
Yeah, and David, I agree with you. I think that data is definitely the lifeblood of accounting and finance. And I would say if you look back over the decades, technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in finance and public accounting. And let's face it, people trust their accountant because their accountant doesn't typically trust anything else. They want to tick and tie all of the numbers. And we have more technology helping in those functions and helping get that lifeblood out of those systems. And if we don't really understand the fundamentals of those systems, we're not going to trust them as much. So I do think it's very important to focus on understanding those fundamentals of IT logic so that you can truly harvest that lifeblood like David was mentioning.
Yeah, and some things on why we should care about it is if leveraged properly, IT logic, which we'll get into exactly what that means in a minute, it can provide transparency to how data is used, error checking capability to ensure data is not used improperly, detection of changes, the integrity of the data, and IT logic can also ensure leading class data use that is maintainable, dependable, efficient, and usable.
Yeah. And David, I spend a lot of my time talking to firms, and they're trying to figure out how to harness the data that they have. And you just mentioned, a lot of big things that they struggle with. How do they make sure that the data is maintainable? How do they make sure that it is dependable? How do they make sure that there's good data integrity and good data hygiene? So what we're going to talk about is not only important to what they're doing with their clients from a data standpoint, but also what they're doing in their own firms from a data standpoint as well.
And I think when we talk about data, it makes sense to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about where data can be stored. And it can be stored in a variety of different places. Single tables files like CSV files. It could be or Excel files. It could be in multiple tables, like spreadsheet files. It could be multiple tables in a database. It could be single or multiple sets of data in a blockchain, which is really just a distributed data repository, which has some unique characteristics. And interestingly enough, data can also be outputted to a screen. So people just think of them as files, but the fact is that displaying the information on a screen is just putting information into a repository, screen being one of them.
For those in our audience who are just learning about this topic, how would you describe the fundamental components of IT logic?
There's three primary components. There's reading data, then there's changing it or transforming it, and then there's outputting it. On the read, you could use the term extract or read. In the transform category, there's three primary different areas, which is select and conditional, and data integrity and error checking, and joining and blending. And then outputting is writing it, whether to a file or whether to a screen.
Yeah. And David, I noticed, there's very little that happens in read and there's very little that happens in output. All of the magic really happens. All of the work really happens in that transform area that you were talking about. So whether it's selecting or error checking or joining. So it's, Kristen, you asked to kind of break it down into simple terms. Yeah, read and output, that you don't get more simpler than that. But the magic is really going to happen in transforming. And that's what I think is really the important part to understand is what happens there in the middle.
And I would add one of the interesting things is, especially in the accounting world, sometimes people think, okay, anything but Excel ends up being big technology and stuff, but the concepts are really valid. They're the same concepts. If you're typing information or copying it into a spreadsheet, it's a very similar concept to having code, import it, or you have a screen where you input it. And as Amanda pointed out, like the transformation, this is one of them. The concepts are very much the same. It's just how it's done a little bit. So, the fear factor in saying, oh, I'm going to scale up to these other bigger technologies, it actually is, they're very similar. And then outputting is, it could be one where you visualize it or you put the information into an output file or you output it to a screen. So everything can be broken into those chunks from an IT logic perspective, and the concepts are valid across many, many different technologies.
David, I'm so glad you mentioned Excel, because I do think that a lot of people out there get intimidated by some of the more, I'll say, technical applications or tools. But the CPAs I know can do more with Excel than most, programmers can do with some other tools. So I do think it's important to recognize that a lot of the fundamentals we already know, we already have, and they can be applied, like you said, if you're stepping up your game into one of those other data manipulation type of applications. So I would say never be afraid of the technology.
Would you be able to share some leading class examples of how IT logic is being applied by organizations and practitioners today?
Absolutely. So the concepts I'm going to go through are ones that is relevant whether someone's coding something or whether they're actually using Excel to actually put that IT logic. And you should break any work that you have into simple sets of work. that just helps things to be maintainable and readable. Making things complex can make it sometimes very difficult to figure out if there's issues. Second is to strive for standardization of inputs, outputs, and calculations. Some of the advantages to this are that if you end up doing that, then if different technologies come along, you can actually take pieces out as opposed to having to redo entire things. Make logic readable is the third. And making things readable goes back to that simple concept at the beginning, which is you want to make sure that your logic is readable. If it becomes too complicated, it's going to be very difficult to maintain or interpret. And then the last one ends up being use the right technology for the purpose. You'll have different sets of people sometimes come into a situation and say, oh, we should be doing this in Python, or we should be doing this in Alteryx, or we should be doing this in Excel. And it's very important that you actually assess the skills that you have that are accessible and figure out what's going to be the right technology to make sure that it is going to be something that works and can be maintained properly.
Yeah, I would say, David, if Excel will do the trick, then use Excel. It's something that we know. But if you do need to go up to something a little beefier, I think you mentioned Alteryx earlier. You still need to keep it very simple. I love what you said about needing to make sure that it's readable, because again, we're going to need to be able to explain the logic being used so that we can explain it to other people. So I completely agree with everything you've said. Break it down, keep it simple. Simple is usually the most elegant when it comes to code. And yeah, make it just easy. And make it readable for people.
Yeah, and a couple of additional things just to, just on the making logic readable. Two things, and this is true regardless of where it is. Understandable naming. If naming things make them understandable, something that's a little natural language. And then comments. Comment to make IT logic and steps understandable. This is regardless of the technology. And it's funny because you may think, oh, well, that's for someone else. And the answer is no. Sometimes you're going to pick something up a couple months or a couple of years later. And if you actually put really, really good comments in there, you'll be surprised on how much time it saves you.
Yeah, David, I think you just triggered a flashback for me. I haven't done any coding since I was in college, but I can attest to how important it is to use comments in your code, like you said, not just for other people, but for yourself, because you are going to come back to it. And yeah, like you mentioned, using a naming convention that is simple and descriptive, things that are going to make sense to to anyone who's reading it. Those things will go a long way in helping you down the road when you have to come back to this stuff.
Yeah, and I think the one last thing that I think would be useful is a comment on the right technology for the purpose. Technology can really be broken roughly into three major areas, and I'm going to use the terms that are actually used. They're a little too overused, but I'm going to use it. So people consider like Excel a manual solution. Manual in a lot of cases ends up sort of indicating a lot of work, but that doesn't mean there's not automation in Excel. It's just considered more of a manual solution. Excel is a great dynamic solution. Its optimals when patterns are not known, are non-standardized. There's non-standardized processes. And I will say that in accounting finance, this is definitely the case. I mean, when you have rules change and you have different fact patterns for different clients and different situations, Excel can be your most powerful ally. Trying to actually, systematize, automate something which has not yet created a knowable pattern is not always the best approach. So the other thing that's great about something like Excel is that it's understandable by almost everyone. So it's a great solution. The next category is configurable solutions. And a good example of this is a tool called Alteryx. Alteryx is really a configurable desktop solution for data wrangling. It's optimal when patterns are somewhat standardized, but it also can be put into the hands of users. It does require some level of learning, but it allows automation within the hands of practitioners. The last technology area is a coding solution, for example, Python. And this can be extremely powerful and fast for standardized data, It requires an environment to run, generally a server versus a desktop, and it requires a higher degree of understanding to write and run. Excel really falls for most people into the category of a manual solution. Very dynamic, can have some errors if you don't know what you're doing. Automation is the last two, which is really, you can automate things with the configurable solutions and the coding solutions. And these are very good, but as you go toward the coding solution, making changes a lot of times ends up being more work and is used by more than just one person at a time.
Yeah, what I would add to that, David, you mentioned earlier, Excel is something that everyone really knows. We think about it as a manual solution, but trying to do something in Excel is a great thought exercise. To test out some of that IT logic, to see if the data is going to do what you expect it to do, to see if the tool, if Excel can do what you want it to do before moving on to one of those configurable solutions or even a coding solution. And I would reiterate that even something like the configurable solutions, as you mentioned, it does take a bit of knowledge, a bit of training, and some learning there. However, it's not that much more complicated than something like Excel. Yes, when you get into coding, that is definitely a much bigger lift, but your natural progression, if you can do something in Excel or if you find limitations in Excel, it's not a big jump to go to one of those configurable solutions because they have taken the coding behind it, if you will, and made it a little easier for us to understand. So it's a little easier to manipulate and connect the different systems and the data in those areas or in those solutions opposed to using a coding solution like Python.
Just to tie things up a little bit in terms of concluding. So regardless of the technology used, you still want to use those leading IT practices, breaking any work into simple sets of work, striving for standardization of inputs, outputs, and calculations, making your logic readable, and using the right technology for the purpose. And if you end up doing that, you can end up providing transparency to how the data is used, error checking to ensure the data is not used improperly, detecting changes, checking the data integrity, and ensuring that leading class data is used that is maintainable, dependable, efficient, and usable.
Yeah, I think that's what we're striving there for, that maintainable, dependable, efficient, and usable. And David, I know we have barely even scratched the surface of IT logic and what that really means, but I know you have put together a very thorough presentation and program that we're going to do. I believe that's March 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And Kristen, you can check my time on that. Do I have that correct?
Yes, Amanda, that is correct. So this is in our technology webcast series for this year, 2021. So David will be taking a deeper dive for any of you that would like to learn more and hear more about additional steps you can take to apply these IT logic concepts within your organization or with your clients. Again, that is March 16th from 1 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, and one last thing, which is something that we really didn't go into too much today, but I think, Amanda, you can say a little bit of words about the importance of a data strategy.
Oh, absolutely. This is something that we're talking to a lot of firms right now. Again, everyone's trying to figure out how to harness their data. And you mentioned earlier, David, about all of the various places and various formats that data can really be stored. And firms, again, are really trying to harness their data. So it's extremely important to start asking yourself, what data do you have? where is it located? Who is responsible for it? Who is maintaining it? How long are you going to keep it? And the basics of IT logic are really going to help you manage that data a lot more efficiently. So, again, I would highly recommend attending the webcast on March 16th to get a deeper dive into the foundations of IT logic and how you can start harnessing your data a lot better.
And that's it for the February Tech Advisory edition of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. Thanks to my co-presenters David Kovar and Amanda Wilkie. If you'd like to connect with them, we'll put their profile links into our show notes. To view those notes, just tap on this episode's info icon in the podcast app on your smartphone or tablet. You can also open this episode in your computer's web browser. That's where you'll also find further information and links about the fundamentals of IT logic, including additional online resources. Remember to have a look at our archive of back episodes too. More than 140 of those at your fingertips whenever you want, provided with our compliments. You can find them wherever you already get your podcasts or your music, so that means Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more. And of course, we're at gobeyonddisruption.com. From Durham, North Carolina, I'm Kristen Hughes. Until next time, keep listening and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.